It was August 1945, on the island of Guam, where the war was breathing its last in broken gasps. The jungle was heavy with smoke and the echo of retreating gunfire. For days, rain had fallen on mud that swallowed footprints and blood alike. Amid that chaos, a small truck rattled along a dirt path, carrying a dozen women in silence. Among them sat a young Japanese nurse, barely 22, her khaki uniform torn and darkened with sweat. The air smelled of rust, salt, and fear. Each bump in the road jolted her ribs, still sore from the last night's march. She held her breath as the truck slowed, knowing this was the end of her capture and the beginning of something she could not name. Her name had once meant grace, but now it clung to her like a burden. She had been an army nurse in the Philippines before the retreat scattered them like ashes across the Pacific. For weeks she had tended to the wounded in collapsing field hospitals, stitching torn flesh by candlelight and rationing morphine until there was none left. When the American landing came, she fled with the others, running barefoot through the coral paths until her lungs burned. Hunger hollowed her cheeks, and her last act of service had been to share half of a boiled egg with a dying signal operator whose name she never learned. That was 3 days before capture. Now, staring through the slats of the truck, she felt as though her life had already ended somewhere in those jungles. The truck jerked to a stop in front of a gate of barbed wire. The clang of metal echoed, sharp and final. The women sat frozen. They had all heard the same warnings, whispered in barracks and scribbled in notes. Surrender was not survival, it was erasure. The Imperial Army had promised that capture meant humiliation worse than death. They had said the Americans would brand them, strip them, and mock their shame. One girl in Manila had slit her wrists with a scalpel rather than face that fate. The memory of her blood spreading. The tile floor haunted the nurse even now. She clenched her hands tightly around the edge of the bench, ready for the first shout, the first blow, the first proof that the stories were true. But none came. Instead, the gate creaked open, slow and almost uncertain. An American soldier stepped forward. His rifle hung loosely by his side. His face was young, sunburned, tired. He did not yell. He simply gestured toward the yard inside and nodded. The women hesitated, glancing at one another in disbelief, waiting for the trap to reveal itself. Then one by one they climbed down from the truck, their bare feet meeting the packed dirt. The nurse followed, her pulse pounding in her ears. She braced for the command that never arrived. The only sound was the rustle of palm leaves and the low hum of distant engines. Inside the camp, there were rows of wooden barracks and a water tower that cast its shadow like a cross. Laundry fluttered from a line, and smoke drifted from a cookhouse nearby. She smelled it before she saw it. Something rich and impossible. Bacon. The word meant nothing to her, but the scent struck her like a memory she didn't own. It was warm, fatty, real. It carried no cruelty in it, only confusion. Her stomach twisted. Could mercy have a smell? Could the enemy's camp carry the scent of food instead of blood? They were led to a registration table. The guards spoke softly, using gestures more than words. A man in uniform asked for her name, scribbled something on a clipboard, and handed her a blanket. Another gave her a tin cup filled with water. She stared at it suspiciously before daring to drink. The coolness hit her throat like glass. It was the first clean water she had tasted in weeks. No one laughed. No one shouted. No one touched her. She waited for the blow that never came. When the sun fell, she lay on a cot inside the barracks, the thin mattress pressing softly against her aching body. The roof creaked in the wind, and outside the crickets sang. She could not close her eyes. She feared sleep would bring the nightmare her waking mind refused to believe. Her uniform was folded neatly beside her. Her hands trembled. She had not been stripped. She had not been paraded. The guards outside spoke in low tones, their words calm and almost ordinary. The enemy did not sound like monsters. That frightened her more than anything. She turned her face to the wall and whispered a prayer, but the words felt hollow. What God would hear a woman captured, dishonored, alive when she should have died? Her stomach growled softly. Somewhere nearby someone laughed. An American voice, light and human. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, hating the sound for being so normal. The nurse shut her eyes and saw her mother's face, the shrine at home, the bowl of rice placed before her brother's photograph. Would they still honor her if they knew she had surrendered? Would they believe she was still human? The imperial code said no. The war had taken her uniform, her pride, her country. Now it was stealing her certainty. But as she lay there, she realized the enemy had given her something else in return. Silence. Not the silence of death, but of absence. No screams, no whips, no mockery. It was quiet enough to think, and that frightened her even more. Because in that silence, doubt began to grow. If everything she had been told about the Americans was a lie, what else might be? She turned her head toward the faint light spilling through the cracks in the wooden wall. It smelled faintly of soap. In that fragile quiet, she realized something was shifting. The war had taught her that enemies had faces of demons, but now those faces were human, tired and strange. She wanted to hate them, but hatred needed certainty, and hers was beginning to crumble. She closed her eyes and whispered a single thought she could barely admit even to herself. Morning crept over the compound like a veil, pale and thin. No trumpets, no barked commands. The nurse woke to the rasp of palm fronds and a kettle hissing somewhere in the mess. She lay very still, waiting for the old terror to surge, the kind that clamps the throat and reminds the body that it belongs to no one. It did not come. The barracks smelled of rough cotton and dust. Cots creaked softly as other women shifted in sleep, each guarding her own small island of breath. The nurse touched her cheek and felt clean skin where there had been grime. She had not earned this comfort. That thought alone made her chest hurt. Outside, the yard stretched between low buildings and a water tower that looked like a watchful eye. Men in fatigues moved without hurry, carrying crates, rolling barrels, passing tools hand to hand. No one shouted. A guard near the gate adjusted his cap and yawned. Off to the right, smoke climbed in gentle ribbons from the cookhouse, and with it came the scent she still did not have a word for, the warm promise that had struck her like a spell the day before. The smell did not accuse. It beckoned. She hated that it beckoned. They lined up for roll call. Names were read awkwardly, syllables bent by unfamiliar tongues. The nurse listened to her name travel through an American mouth and land in the air with a thud. A sergeant with a clipboard counted softly and nodded. A private set a metal bucket on the ground and stepped back. Inside were cups of water. The women stared. No one moved. The private waited, eyes down, as if the act required no permission. Finally, one of the older women stepped forward, took a cup, and drank. Nothing happened. No laughter, no slap. The waiting dissolved into motion. The nurse drank last, and felt the coolness settle in her bones like a truce she had not accepted. Intake came with quiet gestures and a table of forms. A medic with gentle hands lifted a lamp and examined her eyes. Typhus checks, bandages rewrapped. A salve. That smelled faintly of menthol. The nurse tried to map the trap in her mind. Kindness must be a lure. Respect must be camouflage for the humiliation to come. She searched the faces for malice and found only exhaustion. The enemy looked like farm boys pulled into a story bigger than their shoulders could carry. That frightened her more than a scowl would have. A monster is easy to hate, a tired boy is not. Mess hours brought tin trays and a line that wound past a window where a cook ladled oatmeal and something sweet. The women held their trays without speaking, guarding posture like armor. When food touched the metal, some flinched. The nurse did not look at the men serving. She kept her eyes fixed on the tray and counted her breaths. At a corner table, two GIs argued in low voices about a baseball team she had never heard of. Another soldier read a letter with his lips moving. A corporal with a hat too wide for his head stood near a door, scratching a note on a scrap of paper with a carpenter's pencil. Her gaze caught on the hat, a shape out of a storybook, and slipped away. After breakfast, work assignments came. Laundry, kitchen prep, sorting bandages in the dispensary. The nurse was sent to the medical hut to fold gauze and inventory iodine. She walked past the Quonset hut listed as non-essential, its door chained back, a mud scar where floodwater had poured out weeks ago. She smelled a sour metal tang and heard the slow complaint of a loose pipe. The place felt abandoned, a ribcage with no heart. She did not know it yet, but someone had already decided the hut would not remain a ruin. The medical hut was cooler than the barracks. Shelves lined the walls with neat rows of bottles. The American nurse on duty nodded once, no smile, no frown, simply acknowledgement. They worked without words. Hands learned to move in a new choreography. Strip, fold, stack, tie. The rhythm steadied the mind. At midday, a private arrived with a tray of sandwiches and set it near the door without looking inside. The American nurse sliced one in half and left the piece beside the gauze with a tin cup of water. The captured nurse stared at it for a long time before touching the bread. It was soft. It did not taste like victory or defeat. It tasted like wheat and salt. That was almost unbearable. In the yard, the world kept breathing. A jeep coughed to life, sputtered and died. Laughter rose, brief and surprised. Tools clinked against concrete. Somewhere a harmonica traced a tune that did not know this language but tried to speak anyway. The nurse carried fresh bandages to the dispensary and caught a glimpse of the paper taped to the motor pool wall, a supply list filled with scratchy letters. Near the bottom, in a different hand, someone had written a request that did not belong among tires and belts. Pipe, half-inch. Valves, 2. Soap, any kind. Canvas, clean. No signature, only a small inked star that felt like a whisper. She read it and felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the breeze. By late afternoon, the heat pressed low and steady. The women stood in the shade of the barracks, letting sweat trace their spines in quiet lines. A mechanic in rolled sleeves walked past with a coil of copper across his shoulder. He did not stare at them. He nodded once and kept moving. Another man carried a basket that clinked softly, and the nurse saw the edges of wrapped bars inside, cream-colored, stamped with letters she could not read. The convoy turned toward the Quonset hut. The chain on the door sighed. The copper flashed in the sun and vanished into the shadow. The camp shifted almost imperceptibly. A rumor traveled sideways. Someone said the water in the hut had hissed. Someone else said they had seen steam crawl along the ceiling and scatter the dust. The nurse tried not to listen. Hope is a crueler captor than fear. Yet her ears strained for the sound, and when she heard a valve knock twice and settle into a steady hum, her heart answered in the same rhythm. The men came and went, not in a rush, but with the patience of people who fix fences before storms. The odd hat appeared again at the threshold, brim tilted, hands black with grease. He did not step inside. He spoke to no one. He lifted a wrench, tested a joint, and waited. As the sky blushed toward evening, a thin ribbon of steam escaped the eave and curled into the light. The women gathered for evening roll call. The nurse counted the cranes that were not there yet. As if desire could fold paper by itself, she told herself to be careful, to expect nothing, to harden the place inside that wanted to believe. Then the medic on duty made a quiet announcement. Hygiene rotation would begin at dusk, 6 at a time. Privacy maintained, no exceptions. The words fell like rain on dry earth. No one moved, no one cheered. The body remembers how to protect itself. The nurse kept her eyes on the dirt and felt the ground sway. When dusk came, a guard, older and balding, stood by the Quonset door with a ledger. He looked like a man who had been told to watch the sunset and write down its color. The first 6 women approached in a knot. The nurse was not among them. She gripped the barracks rail until her knuckles whitened and pressed her forehead to the wood. Across the yard a whistle sounded, low and tuneless. The door closed gently. Steam unfurled through the roof vent and vanished into the purple light. No screams came, no orders. Only the steady hiss of water and the soft scuff of feet on concrete. When the first group emerged, wrapped in plain cotton, eyes red and faces slack, with something that looked like mourning and mercy in the same breath, the nurse felt her ribs loosen. One woman carried a towel to the rail and folded it twice as if it were silk. Another pressed a bar of soap to her chest and held it there a moment, before setting it back in a wire basket by the door. Corporal Elijah Mac Graw wasn't a man built for war. He was a ranch hand from Blanco County, Texas, a place where fences needed mending more than people needed saving, and where a man's word was stronger than a contract. When the army drafted him, they didn't get a soldier. They got a mechanic with sunburnt hands and a slow, steady drawl that sounded like it had never learned to hurry. He wasn't the kind to shout orders or polish boots for rank. He was the kind who fixed things, the kind who believed a tool could tell you the truth if you listened long enough. He'd been at the camp for barely a month when the truck carrying the Japanese nurses arrived. He watched from a distance, arms folded, chewing on a piece of straw. The women moved like ghosts, heads bowed, their uniforms in tatters. He could see their ribs through the fabric, see the way they flinched at shadows. He'd seen that look before, not in prisoners but in dying cattle when drought burned the rivers dry. It wasn't fear that hollowed them out. It was disbelief. The kind of disbelief that comes when the world stops making sense. The Quonset hut sat behind the motor pool, a half-flooded shell that everyone ignored. Its pipes had burst weeks earlier, turning the floor into a swamp of rust and filth. The engineers had been ordered elsewhere. Bridges, fuel depots, anything that could win battles. No one cared about a broken hut meant for captured women. But Elijah couldn't stop thinking about it. He had watched those women step off the truck barefoot, lice in their hair, skin cracked and blistered. The officers spoke of rations, blankets, quarantine. No one spoke of dignity. One morning, while the camp still yawned awake, he stood outside that hut with a mug of coffee in hand. Steam drifted from the open doorway, faint and ghostly. He didn't ask permission. He didn't file a requisition. He just set his mug down and got to work. He walked to the scrapyard behind the mess hall, found a pile of discarded copper tubing, and dragged it across the yard. From the motor pool he borrowed a hacksaw, a wrench, and a soldering iron. By noon, sweat darkened the brim of his hat. He crouched in the mud, cutting and joining pipes with the kind of focus that made the rest of the world fall away. Piece by piece, the skeleton of a new system took shape, rough, uneven, but alive. He scavenged an old boiler connection from the kitchen's water line, spliced it with a T-joint, and built a bypass to feed the hut. It wasn't regulation, it wasn't pretty. But when he turned the valve, the pipe shuddered, coughed, and finally exhaled a breath of steam. He smiled quietly to himself, the kind of smile that lives more in the eyes than the mouth. He patched the holes in the roof and hung a canvas divider for privacy. From spare tent hooks, he made a line of pegs along the wall. He found a wire basket, cleaned it, and filled it with bars of soap bought off a cook in exchange for cigarettes he didn't smoke. When he stepped back, he saw something no one else would notice, a room that could make people feel human again, even for 10 minutes. The floor was still scarred concrete, the walls still dented tin, but the air smelled faintly of lavender. That evening a sergeant passed by and squinted at the hut. "You fixing plumbing for the enemy, Cowboy?" he asked, half-joking. Elijah didn't look up from his wrench. "Just fixing a leak, sir," he said. The sergeant laughed, shook his head and walked on. That was all the permission he needed. When the water first ran hot, Elijah didn't tell anyone. He waited for the right moment. When the women had been processed, when fear had dulled into exhaustion. The next morning, he told the medic there was a working shower. The medic, a quiet man from Ohio, looked at him with surprise. "You mean the hut?" Elijah nodded, figured they could use it. The medic hesitated, then said softly, "That's not protocol." Elijah looked up, wiping sweat from his forehead. Neither's decency most days. By dusk, the first 6 women were led toward the hut. Elijah stood by the doorway, not inside, just outside where the sunlight broke across the dirt. He tipped his hat as they passed but said nothing. They entered slowly, their bodies stiff with dread. The door closed behind them. Moments later he heard the pipes groan, the soft hiss of water, and then silence, not fear, not screams, just silence thick enough to swallow the world. Inside, he imagined the steam rising, washing months of grime from their skin. He imagined the weight falling from their shoulders, the dirt turning to rivers at their feet. Then he heard it, a sound so small it almost broke him. A sob, then another. He turned his head away and fixed his gaze on the horizon. He chewed the inside of his cheek and waited until the sound became steady breathing again. When they stepped out, wrapped in plain cotton garments, their eyes were red, but not from shame. Something had shifted. One woman pressed a towel to her face as if memorizing the feel of it. Another held the soap in both hands, afraid to let go. They didn't thank him. They didn't need to. He just tipped his hat again and watched them walk back toward the barracks, their steps lighter, their silence changed. Later that night, Elijah sat by the motor pool, cleaning the rust from his tools. The stars were out, scattered and pale. A private wandered by and asked what he'd been building all day. "A shower," Elijah said. The private laughed. "For them? The Japs?" Elijah looked up slowly. "For people," he said. The private blinked, not sure what to make of that, and walked away. He didn't sleep much that night. He kept hearing the sound of water striking concrete, steady and patient, like rain after a long drought. He thought of his mother heating bath water in a tin tub back home, the way she'd hum while it boiled, the way the steam had softened even the hardest days. It was late evening when her turn finally came. The nurse stood at the edge of the yard, clutching her thin blanket around her shoulders, staring at the hut that breathed steam into the purple dusk. The air smelled faintly of soap and metal, strange and clean, like something forbidden. A guard read 6 names from a clipboard. Hers was the last. Her throat tightened and her feet refused to move at first. The warnings she had grown up with echoed in her mind. Surrender brings shame, captivity brings ruin. Every step toward that door felt like betrayal. The women entered together, a small flock of silence. The nurse felt the concrete under her bare feet, cold and rough. Inside, the light was dim. The ceiling was low and curved like a tin shell. Pipes ran overhead, patched and clumsy, dripping at the joints. In one corner, a canvas curtain hung from wire, and behind it, water hissed softly, steady and alive. No soldiers shouted, no eyes watched, only the sound of heat meeting air. She stood frozen, afraid to move. One of the older women pressed her back against the wall, clutching her tattered uniform, unwilling to undress. Another stood with arms crossed, eyes shut, whispering a prayer to a god that had stopped listening months ago. The smell of soap drifted closer, lavender and strange. It filled the air like a memory she did not own. The nurse reached for the fabric at her shoulder, hesitated, and stopped. Then she heard a voice outside the curtain, low and gentle. "It ain't much," it said, "but it's warm." The voice was deep, slow, and unfamiliar, the man they called Cowboy. She had seen him once in the yard, broad-shouldered, his hat tilted low, hands scarred from work. Now his tone carried through the thin metal like a heartbeat. He didn't sound like a captor. He sounded like someone apologizing for the world. The nurse closed her eyes and pulled the cloth from her shoulders. The air touched her skin like frost. She stepped forward. When the first stream of water struck her, she gasped. It was hot, hotter than she'd imagined. Her body flinched, then softened. The dirt came loose from her skin in dark streaks. Blood and dust and months of fear slid down her arms and gathered at her feet. Her breath broke into small, shaking sobs that surprised even her. Beside her, another woman began to cry too, her voice muffled against the rush of water. Then another. It spread quietly, not in pain, not in despair, but in something older and deeper. Relief. The sound filled the hut like a hymn without words. For the first time in months, they were not soldiers, not prisoners, not dishonored. They were bodies again, alive and warm. The soap was pale and smooth. She rubbed it between her hands and watched the foam bloom like flowers in spring. It smelled faintly of lavender, the kind used in temples back home. She pressed it to her shoulder, to her neck, and then stopped, staring at her own reflection in the wet concrete. She did not recognize herself. The woman in front of her looked younger, almost human. Her knees gave out. She sank to the floor, the soap cradled in her lap like something sacred. Water fell around her in silver ribbons, hiding her tears. Minutes passed before the medic knocked gently on the door. "Time," he said softly. The women did not answer. They stepped out one by one, wrapped in plain cotton robes. No one spoke. The nurse walked last, her hair dripping, her fingers trembling. Outside, the evening had deepened into blue. The man called Cowboy stood by the doorway, hat pulled low, looking at the ground. He didn't glance at them, didn't speak, just tipped his hat slightly as they passed. The nurse hesitated at the step, the steam curling behind her like breath. She wanted to say something, to thank him, to curse him, to ask why, but no words came. She just looked once toward his face and saw not pride, not pity, only quiet concern. Then she walked away. That night, she couldn't sleep. The barracks was still, filled with the soft sound of breathing. She lay staring at the wooden rafters above her, tracing the lines with her eyes. Her skin still carried the scent of soap. Her hair brushed against the pillow, clean for the first time in months. She touched her arm where the bruises had faded to yellow and whispered into the dark. Why would they do this? No one answered. Outside, the camp was silent except for the wind moving through the palms. Somewhere beyond the barracks, a harmonica played a slow tune, lonely but gentle. She didn't know who played it, but she recognized the melody, the same rhythm the pipes had made when the water began to flow. She imagined the man sitting alone, hat tipped forward, humming into the night. In the morning, the women avoided each other's eyes. They moved through roll call as if the night had been a dream, but the nurse knew it hadn't. Her hands were proof, her clean skin proof. She caught herself staring at the hut, still steaming faintly in the early light. A private passed by carrying fresh towels and whistling softly. She felt the heat rise in her chest. It wasn't anger, it wasn't gratitude either. It was confusion, the kind that unravels everything you thought you knew. Later that day, she caught a glimpse of Cowboy again. He was crouched by the motor pool, tightening a bolt, a piece of straw between his teeth. He looked up briefly and saw her watching. For a moment, neither moved. Then he nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement, and went back to work. She didn't return the nod, but something inside her shifted. That night, as the lights dimmed and the camp slipped into silence, she lay awake thinking of that single moment, the water falling, the warmth, the absence of cruelty. She had been told that the enemy would take her dignity, that captivity would strip her bare. But the man who guarded the door had given her something no nation could have promised, mercy without demand. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. The paper came to her in the strangest way. Morning light ran like milk across the yard, and the nurse was sweeping the dispensary floor when Cowboy appeared in the doorway with a pencil behind his ear and a folded sheet in his hand. He did not step inside. He held the page out as if it might be fragile enough to break between them. "You can write home if you want," he said. His voice carried no weight of authority, only the awkward kindness of a man offering water to someone who has forgotten thirst. She stared at the white rectangle as if it were a blade. For a moment, she did not reach. If she took it, something would open. If she refused, something would close. She took it. The paper was too clean. It glowed in the dim hut like winter sky after a storm. The pencil was dull and warm from the heat of his ear. He nodded once and left without waiting for thanks. The room seemed to widen in his absence, like a breath finally released. The American nurse at the table pretended not to notice. Both women knew that the page was not a promise. Mail could die at sea. Censors could turn lines to ash. But the page had weight, and her fingers could feel it. That alone changed the day. She held the paper through morning and into afternoon. She folded it, unfolded it, pressed it flat against her knee. In the barracks at dusk, she laid it on the blanket as if setting an altar. The others saw and did not speak. A lamp burned at the rafters, its light a soft gold that made the page glow again. She waited until the last cough quieted and the night settled in around them. Then she sharpened the pencil with a mess knife and watched the shavings curl like wood petals. Her hand shook as she set the point to the margin. "Mother, I am alive." She stopped. The first sentence felt both true and false, as if truth required a map with more roads than she could draw. Alive was a living word. It had breath and warmth, but alive was not free. Alive was not unbroken. She pressed the pencil harder and wrote again. "We are treated humanely." The word felt foreign in her mouth, like a small stone with a smooth side and a sharp side. She crossed it out and wrote it again. "We are fed, we work, we are allowed to bathe." She paused, and the silence became heavy. The pencil hovered above the page. Should she say it? Should she write about the heat of the water and the lavender smell and the sobs that fell from her like coins from a broken purse? Should she name the man with the hat who turned a wrench and refused to look at their bodies? She waited for shame to stop her. It did not. "There is a man who built a shower for us. He stands at the door and does not look inside. He wears a hat like a storybook. I do not understand him." Her throat closed. She pressed the pencil to the blank and left a small dark dot. She could not write more. The page had taken what it could hold for one night. She folded it 3 times and tucked it under her pillow. She slept with her hand on the corner. She dreamed of warm rain. In the morning, word passed without voices, Paper existed, pencil existed. The camp did not announce it. A quiet exchange began at the dispensary window, at the mess line, at the edge of the yard where shadows gave cover. A page here, another there. Some women wrote immediately, their hands spilling memories as if the floodgates had snapped. Others held their sheets for days, unable to begin. One woman drew pictures instead. She sketched the curve of the Quonset roof and the basket of towels, the round face of the guard who counted like a priest, and the steam that climbed like incense. She drew hands, always hands. The letters became a ritual. The nurse learned to listen for the moment the barracks fell into the deep quiet after lights out. That was when pencils began to move. She heard the scratch of graphite like rain on a tin roof. She heard breath hitch and settle. She heard paper fold. They wrote to mothers and sisters, to children they had not seen, to fathers who would not answer. Some wrote to the dead. "Forgive me," one letter said in careful strokes. "Forgive me that I did not die." The nurse read that line by accident when the wind flipped a page on the sill, and the words struck her heart like a board across a door. Cowboy did not collect the letters all at once. He carried a canvas pouch and walked the barracks row at odd hours, as if he were checking fence lines for breaks. He knocked softly and stood back. If a page slid out, he took it without reading. If none came, he moved on. The pouch grew thicker each day. His shoulders leaned with a weight that was not only paper. He did not complain. He whistled sometimes, a faint tune without name, and the women learned to listen for it. It meant the mail was moving. It meant their words had at least left their hands, even if they never reached ashore. The nurse wrote again. She told the truth where she could. She lied where the truth would not fit the world waiting at home. She did not speak of hunger because the hunger had new edges now. It was not only for food. It was for the right to believe in warmth. She described the hut and left out the fear. She described the water and left out the trembling. She described the man at the door and left out the word mercy because it felt too large to survive the crossing. She ended with a promise she could not keep. "I will see you soon." When she folded the page, her hands would not stop shaking. She placed it in Cowboy's pouch and watched him walk away. He did not look back. In the days that followed, the letters began to change the room without anyone saying how. Posture softened while hands still guarded their bowls. Conversations returned in whispers, then in words. Names were spoken again, true names, not ranks. The nurse sat with a girl who could not write and lent her hand as scribe. The girl told her what to say and then stopped and began to cry when she reached the word father. They held the pencil together and wrote the name anyway. Afterward, the nurse washed her hands and found graphite lines at her fingertips like faint veins, as if the letter had climbed into her skin. A rumor began that a sack of mail had left the island. No one could verify it. The rumor was like a ship on the horizon, there one moment and gone the next. Still the writing continued. The practice mattered even if the delivery did not. The nurse began to keep a tiny ledger of her own in the blank spaces of her mind. One letter finished, one letter waiting, one letter that would never be written because there was no one left to receive it. That last category grew, and she learned to mourn in the space between sentences. Not all letters were gentle. One woman wrote rage so fierce the pencil tore the paper. Another confessed to a sin that had only been survival. A third wrote about a night march and could not stop filling lines with the word cold. They brought those pages to the pouch like offerings that might burn clean. Cowboy accepted them the same way he accepted the folded cranes on the windowsill. He did not ask their stories. He stood for a moment with the weight of them and then carried them away. The day a letter returned, everything changed again. It arrived with a stack of supply papers in the hand of a clerk who looked annoyed to be a messenger. The envelope was grey and stamped in red. It had been opened and resealed and scuffed with the fingerprints of men who would never meet the woman who had written it. The nurse read the address on the front and felt her lungs stall. The letter was for someone else, but it might as well have been for all of them. The woman who had written it stood in the yard with her hands tucked into her sleeves, unable to reach for it. When she finally did, she broke the seal with her teeth, like a starving person tearing bread. The page inside was thin and nearly transparent. The reply was only a few lines, but it held a world. "We thought you were gone." It began quietly, the way all fragile miracles do. No speeches, no orders, no permission. Just a small silver bird perched on the windowsill of the Quonset hut one humid morning. Its wings were uneven, its folds clumsy, and the paper shimmered faintly in the filtered light. The nurse saw it first as she reached for a towel. She froze, hand hovering in the steam, unsure whether to touch it. The crane seemed too delicate for fingers that had known nothing but work and fear. It was made from the foil of a chocolate wrapper, the kind Cowboy sometimes carried in his pockets. Someone must have found one, flattened it, folded it with trembling hands and left it here. A message without words, a memory given shape. She didn't speak of it. None of them did. But that afternoon, when she returned for her shift in the dispensary, she noticed two more cranes on the sill, one smaller than the other, their wings pressed together as if huddling for warmth. The women whispered in corners, but never confessed. It became a secret they all shared without speaking, a quiet rebellion made of scraps. The foil caught the light and turned it into something holy. The nurse would find herself pausing at the window longer each day, her reflection mingling with the shapes of the birds, their wings trembling whenever the wind slipped through the cracks. The cranes became a ritual. Each night after curfew, someone somewhere in the barracks would sit cross-legged on her cot and fold paper in the half-dark, the soft rustle of creases filling the silence between heartbeats. Candy wrappers, ration labels, even the backs of Red Cross flyers, anything that could bend and hold a shape became a canvas. Some women folded perfectly, others made lopsided birds that still managed to stand. The act itself was the prayer. Every fold was a memory reclaimed, a small defiance against the war that had tried to erase their gentleness. Cowboy noticed them within a week. He was crouched by the hut, adjusting a valve, when his eyes lifted to the sill. He saw the birds lined in a neat row, 6 of them now, gleaming like silver shells in the morning light. He said nothing. He simply tipped his hat and went back to tightening the bolt. The nurse, standing nearby with her bucket, saw the gesture and understood. He wouldn't disturb them. He understood that some things were not meant to be explained. In the days that followed, the cranes multiplied. There were a dozen by the end of the second week, each one different. One had a beak that drooped. Another was made from a ration box, the ink bleeding into the folds like veins. The women began adding them quietly, timing their steps so that no one could see who placed them. Yet everyone knew. The cranes belonged to all of them. They were proof that kindness could survive captivity, that beauty could grow from things meant to be thrown away. The hut itself began to change. The smell of lavender soap still lingered, but now there was something else. The faint sweetness of paper and heat, like sunlight caught between pages. The air inside was no longer heavy. It felt alive, filled with the soft sound of dripping water and the distant hum of life returning. When one woman dropped a towel, another bent to help her. When the soap basket emptied, someone refilled it before the guards could notice. The routine had turned into care, and care had turned into strength. One morning, the nurse arrived early and found a younger girl crouched by the window, folding another crane. She was new, captured from a nearby island weeks after the rest. Her hands were shaking. "You fold like this," the nurse said softly, kneeling beside her. She guided the girl's fingers through the creases, steadying them. The foil was from a lemon drop wrapper, shiny and thin. When they finished, the girl smiled faintly, the first smile the nurse had seen in months. Together they placed the crane on the sill. "What does it mean?" the girl asked. The nurse hesitated, then said, "It means we are still here." Each crane carried its own story. One woman folded hers after receiving a letter from home that had only 3 words, "We are alive." Another folded one for a sister who had drowned on the journey south. The nurse folded hers in memory of the first shower, of warmth, of steam, of Cowboy's quiet voice at the door. She used the corner of an old soap carton, the lavender scent still faint on the paper. Her folds were clumsy, but her hands were steady. When she placed it among the others, she whispered something only the walls could hear. Cowboy never asked about the cranes, but they became part of his routine. When he came to check the pipes, he worked around them carefully. If a wing sagged, he straightened it. Once, when condensation from the roof threatened to soak them, he shifted the towel rack so the drips fell harmlessly to the floor. The women noticed but never mentioned it. They didn't need to. The cranes were theirs, but his care guarded them. At night, the nurse sometimes dreamed of them flying. She dreamed of hundreds of silver wings rising over the camp, catching the moonlight and scattering it over the Pacific. In her dream, the sound was not of war, but of wind through paper. When she woke, the room smelled faintly of soap and rain. She would turn toward the window, half expecting to see one missing. They were always still there, lined like sentinels, glowing faintly in the dawn. Weeks passed. The war outside raged on, but inside the fences the camp grew quieter. The cranes became the pulse of their small world. They marked the days better than any calendar could. When new women arrived, they learned the ritual without instruction. When one of them fell ill, the others folded cranes for her and placed them by the window, small prayers for recovery written in silence. The guards never touched them. Even they seemed to understand that some boundaries were sacred. It happened on a hot afternoon when the air felt too heavy to breathe. The sun burned white above the camp, bleaching the yard and dulling every sound. The nurse was cleaning the dispensary table when she heard footsteps, brisk and sharp, the kind that only carried bad news. A young recruit appeared in the doorway, holding a folded slip of paper in his hand. His face was pale. "For Corporal MacGraw," he said to no one in particular. Cowboy looked up from where he was tightening a valve near the hut. He wiped his hands on his trousers, took the note, and read it silently. Then, without a word, he set his wrench down, brushed the copper dust from his palms, and began walking toward headquarters. No one saw him come back. The afternoon dragged on, and the sound of tools in the yard faded. By evening, whispers filled the barracks like a slow-moving tide. Something had changed. The hut still steamed faintly in the falling light, but it felt different, as if the warmth had lost its pulse. The women glanced toward it during roll call, uneasy without knowing why. The nurse stood at the edge of the line, her stomach sinking, a sense of absence already forming before she understood what had been taken. In the command office, 3 officers waited behind a desk. Their uniforms were crisp, their collars starched, their eyes hard in the way that comes from never having dirt under the nails. The oldest one leaned back and tapped the top of a manila folder with his pen. "You've been busy, Corporal," he said flatly. Cowboy didn't answer. "Very busy for someone in maintenance." The second officer opened the file and began listing charges in a clipped voice. Unauthorized plumbing installations, improper entry into the women's quadrant, distribution of government-issued supplies without command approval, a violation of distance, a breach of decorum. "You built a spa for the enemy," the officer said, the last word sharp like glass. Cowboy's hat hung on the back of his chair. He sat, straight, boots planted on the floor, arms resting on his knees. He didn't shift, didn't plead. He waited until the room fell still again. "When's the last time you saw someone cry over hot water?" he said quietly. The officers blinked. One cleared his throat, muttering something about regulations, about keeping order. Cowboy's gaze stayed steady. "I fixed what was broken," he said. "That's all." No one responded. The pen scratched across the report again. The papers were signed, stamped, and slid into a drawer. The meeting ended not with shouting or punishment, but with something colder. Permission withdrawn. "You're reassigned to the motor pool," one officer said. "Effective immediately. No further interaction with the prisoners." Cowboy nodded once, stood, and placed his hat back on his head. He tipped it slightly, not out of respect, but as a farewell to something only he understood, then walked out into the burning sunlight. That evening, the nurse went to the hut for her scheduled shower. The door hung open, the steam rising weakly. Inside, one of the pipes dripped steadily, a small metallic rhythm against the concrete. The towel basket was empty. The air felt colder even though the boiler still ran. The warmth had dulled. She looked toward the window and saw the cranes, still lined in perfect silence, their wings unmoving in the stale air. One of them had begun to sag, the foil softening under the humidity. She reached up to straighten it, her fingers trembling. Something was wrong. The next day confirmed it. The towels were never replaced. The soap ran out. No one came to fix the leak. The guard by the door was new, young, indifferent, clipboard in hand. He didn't whistle. He didn't nod. He didn't care. The women entered and bathed without speaking, their eyes cast downward. The water that hit their skin was cold, not lukewarm or fading, but cold enough to sting. It stole their breath and made their bodies tremble. The nurse stood beneath it, fists clenched, the memory of warmth burning brighter than the water's bite. Later, she heard the truth from a medic who had overheard the officers talking. Cowboy had been reprimanded, not court-martialed, not demoted, just removed, quietly and completely. His name had become a problem, not because of crime, but because of compassion. The hut could stay, the water could run, but the man who had made it more than a building was gone. The nurse sat on her cot that night and stared at the blank ceiling. The war had found its way back in, not with guns or chains, but with silence. The cranes on the windowsill began to wilt. One had fallen forward, its wings crushed against the glass. Another had disappeared, swept away during cleaning rounds. No one dared to ask where. The remaining ones leaned tiredly, their silver dulled. The nurse couldn't bring herself to fold another. The ritual had been about hope, and now hope felt like a luxury too fragile to afford. Still, when she passed the hut, she found herself glancing at the sill, searching for any sign that he might return. He didn't. The next week brought rain, brief but heavy. The camp smelled of wet dust and old oil. Water pooled around the huts and leaked through the roofs. The nurse volunteered for maintenance duty, claiming she could help mop the floors. No one questioned her. Inside the Quonset hut, the floor was slick, the air colder than ever. She found the leak where the copper pipe had cracked and crouched beside it. Her fingers brushed the mark where Cowboy's wrench had once rested. For a moment she could almost see him there, hat tilted, humming under his breath. The vision broke when a drop hit her wrist. The water was freezing. She tightened the valve until it stopped, though she knew it wouldn't hold. That night, the women gathered quietly in the barracks. No one said his name, but they all felt the emptiness he had left behind. Mornings grew colder after Cowboy's departure, though the tropical sun still burned the sky white. The camp seemed quieter, stripped of something invisible. The women no longer looked toward the motor pool when they walked to the showers. The air that once shimmered with warmth now hung heavy, thick with silence. The water still ran, but it was not the same. It hit their skin like shards of glass, each drop a reminder of what had been lost. The nurse stood beneath it, her breath short, her hands trembling. She had thought pain was familiar, but this kind was new. Not the pain of suffering, but the ache of remembering mercy. She lifted her eyes toward the small window above the towel hooks. The cranes were still there, though their wings had wilted with humidity. One had fallen over completely, its foils soaked and dull. Another was gone, swept away by the wind or perhaps by neglect. Yet a few remained, fragile and steadfast, their edges curled inward, as if shielding something precious. She wanted to fix them but didn't. To touch them now felt like reopening a wound that hadn't yet scarred. That night, the rain came again. It began softly, a mist against the tin roof, then built into a steady rhythm. The nurse lay awake listening to it, remembering the sound of hot water striking concrete, remembering Cowboy's voice outside the curtain saying, "It ain't much, but it's warm." She saw him in her mind, shoulders squared, hat pulled low, hands moving with patient care as he fitted each pipe. He had been more than a soldier. He had been a craftsman of mercy, and now he was gone. The next morning, the camp stirred under grey skies. The nurse went to the hut early, hoping to bathe before the others. The guard on duty was new, barely older than a boy, eyes fixed on the mud. He waved her through without a word. Inside, the air was cold, the smell of lavender long faded. She turned the valve and waited. The water came in bursts, uneven and biting. She closed her eyes and let it fall. The first drop hit like memory, shocking her breath away. She stayed still, letting it run over her, until numbness replaced the sting. When she opened her eyes, she saw something new. A crane, freshly folded, standing upright among the old ones. It was brighter, made from a torn piece of paper with red letters bleeding across its wings. A Red Cross flyer. She stared at it, confused. It hadn't been there yesterday. Someone had folded it in the night. She felt tears rise before she could stop them. Perhaps one of the other women had made it, perhaps not. It didn't matter. The message was clear. The warmth might have gone, but the lesson had stayed. Outside, the sound of marching boots echoed faintly. The war was ending. Rumors had reached the camp. The guards were restless. Supplies had dwindled. Each day brought new uncertainty. Some women whispered about repatriation, others about transfer. The nurse didn't know which would come first. All she knew was that the end of one kind of captivity didn't mean freedom from memory. In the following days, the showers became more ritual than necessity. They came not to wash but to remember. The nurse would step inside, close her eyes, and let the cold water trace her skin, imagining it warm again, imagining the hum of pipes and the faint tune Cowboy used to whistle. The cold no longer frightened her. It had become the language of survival, a way to keep his kindness alive inside her. The other women began to follow her lead. They moved slower, gentler, helping each other balance on the slick floor. One passed a folded rag to another, and another helped wring water from her hair. They spoke little, but their silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of fear, it was reverence. They had turned the act of bathing into a ceremony, a quiet defiance against the cruelty of the world outside. Weeks later, the day of departure arrived. The nurse woke before dawn to the sound of trucks idling outside the fence. A list had been posted by the mess tent, names typed faintly on thin paper. Hers was among them. She folded the sheet and tucked it into her pocket. The barracks buzzed with subdued movement. Some women cried softly, others stood staring into space. Release didn't feel like freedom. It felt like stepping out of one silence and into another. Before boarding the truck, the nurse slipped away toward the hut one last time. The door creaked open, the smell of rust stronger than ever. The cranes still lined the sill, though many had slumped. She stood in the doorway staring at them. Then, slowly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small square of paper, the wrapper from a piece of chocolate Cowboy had once given her. It was creased and faded, the edges worn thin from being handled too many times. Her fingers shook as she folded it. Each crease felt like a heartbeat, soft but steady. When she finished, she placed the tiny crane on the windowsill beside the others. For a moment, the hut was silent except for the faint dripping of the pipe. The light caught the silver wings, making them glow softly in the gloom. The nurse took a step back, then whispered, "Thank you." The word felt strange in her mouth, but right. She turned, closed the door gently behind her, and walked away. When the trucks pulled out, she looked back once. The Quonset hut stood small against the grey horizon, steam still curling faintly from its vents. The cranes were just specks in the window, but she could see them shimmer as the morning light broke through the clouds. They looked almost alive, like they might lift at any moment and take flight over the fence, carrying their stories into the sky. As the truck rattled down the dirt road, she pressed her hand against her chest. The paper wrapper she had kept for months was gone now, left behind as part of something larger than herself. Yet she felt lighter. The water, the warmth, the cranes, all of it had changed her in ways she couldn't name. She closed her eyes and let the wind brush her face. For the first time since capture, she smiled. The war had stolen nearly everything from her. Her country, her certainty, her pride. But inside that small hut, through one man's quiet defiance, she had learned that kindness could outlast any empire. And though the world beyond still burned, she carried with her a single truth that no army could erase. Mercy, once given, lives forever in the hearts it touches. The ship that carried them home was grey and loud, its decks crowded with tired faces, staring toward the horizon. The Pacific stretched endless and empty around them, as if trying to wash the war away. The nurse sat alone near the stern, a wool blanket over her shoulders, watching the waves break against the hull. Each crest shimmered for a heartbeat before collapsing into foam. She thought of the cranes on the windowsill, of how they had glimmered in the morning light as the truck pulled away. The image clung to her like a memory that refused to fade. The voyage lasted weeks. The air was heavy with salt and the smell of oil. Meals were silent. The women ate without appetite. Some wrote letters they would never send. Others simply stared at the water, unable to believe that land still existed somewhere beyond the sea. The nurse kept her hands folded in her lap, tracing the faint creases where the paper crane had once rested before she left it behind. At night, when the deck grew quiet, she would close her eyes and hear the hiss of hot water, the tune Cowboy used to hum, the sound of soft sobbing that had once filled the Quonset hut like prayer. When the ship finally reached Yokohama, the world she had known no longer existed. The port was silent except for the cawing of gulls. Smoke rose from the city in the distance, thin and endless. Buildings stood like teeth broken at the root, and the air carried the smell of ash and salt. The streets were filled with people, but they moved like ghosts, slow, hollow, eyes fixed on the ground. The war had ended, yet it had not released them. Her family was waiting at the station. Her mother wept when she saw her, pressing both hands to her face. Her father stood behind her, thinner than she remembered, the skin around his eyes pale from sleepless nights. They did not speak at first. The nurse bowed, stiff and awkward, then let her mother's arms fold around her. The embrace felt both familiar and foreign, like stepping into a life that no longer fit. Her father gave a nod but said nothing. The home she returned to was small and cold. The sliding doors no longer fit their frames. The tatami mats had gone soft from damp air. A single photo of her brother stood on the altar, his smile caught forever in the uniform of a soldier who would never come back. That night, as the family gathered around a small charcoal stove, her mother whispered prayers for the dead. The nurse sat in silence, her hands resting on her knees. The warmth from the fire was weak, nothing like the heat she remembered. She wanted to tell them what had happened, to speak of the kindness she had found in a place built for captivity, but the words refused to come. How could she explain that mercy had come from the enemy's hands? How could she say that she had felt safer among strangers than among her own? To tell the truth would sound like betrayal. To stay silent felt like a lie. Days turned into weeks. Neighbors came by with cautious smiles and curious eyes. They asked about the camps, about the Americans, about the journey home. She gave them the answers they wanted, short, formal, empty of detail. We were treated fairly, she said. We survived. She left out everything that mattered. She did not speak of the lavender soap or the warm water or the man who had built them both with his bare hands. At night, she could not sleep. The silence in her house was different from the one in the camp. There, it had been a silence filled with life, the shuffle of footsteps, the hiss of pipes, the soft sound of breathing beside her cot. Here, it was hollow, heavy, endless. The walls groaned in the wind. The stove coughed smoke. Her parents spoke in whispers, as if afraid that raising their voices might summon ghosts. One evening, as the light faded, she went to the small kitchen and filled a kettle with water. She set it on the coals and waited. The flame licked the metal, slow and steady. She sat on the floor with her knees drawn to her chest, watching the first curls of steam rise into the dim air. The sound was soft, almost musical. Something inside her broke open. She pressed her palms to her eyes, and tears came silently falling into her lap. The warmth on her face felt like an old friend returning. In that moment, the memories flooded back. The sound of water on concrete, the smell of soap, the line of cranes trembling in the heat. She saw Cowboy standing at the door, head bowed, hands rough from work, guarding the threshold without ever crossing it. She heard his quiet voice again, steady and kind. "It ain't much, but it's warm." She smiled through her tears. The kettle whistled sharply, and she took it off the fire. The steam wrapped around her like a blanket, and for a moment she felt she was back inside that hut, surrounded by women who had learned, like her, that dignity could survive even in the heart of war. Her mother entered the room and paused. "You're crying," she said softly. The nurse wiped her eyes and shook her head. "It's just the steam," she whispered. Her mother nodded and said nothing more. Together they sat beside the stove, the sound of the boiling water filling the quiet between them. Over the next months, she found herself drawn to that ritual. Each time she boiled water, for tea, for soup, for washing, she would pause when the first steam appeared and close her eyes. The warmth reminded her that she had once been seen not as an enemy, not as a prisoner, but as a person. The world outside still called her survivor, but she knew that word was too small. She had not only survived, she had been changed. Sometimes, when she walked through the streets and saw the ruins, she thought about how easily things broke. Homes, cities, hearts, and how some things, even fragile as paper, endured. The cranes would still be there in her memory, lined in silver light, waiting in that forgotten hut on a faraway island. She carried them with her, like a secret prayer, each fold etched into her heart. The war had left her with scars she could not show and gratitude she could not explain. But when the kettle sang and the air filled with warmth, she no longer felt alone. She would breathe it in and whisper a name she had never dared to speak aloud, a name that still felt like hope. The world outside might never understand, but she did. Mercy was not weakness. Compassion was not surrender. They were strength, the quiet kind that outlives wars. And as long as she could make the water boil, as long as she could watch the steam rise, she would remember the lesson that had carried her across oceans. Kindness, once given, never dies. Years passed the way quiet rainfall passes through soil, unseen and steady. The nurse became a wife, then a mother, then a woman who measured time by the height of a child against a doorframe and the seasons of rice and tea. The city around her stitched itself together in stubborn pieces. Streets reopened, shops found their signs again, children learned new songs that did not belong to soldiers. In the small house where she lived, the kettle on the brazier became a clock that no one named. Its first soft sigh in the morning said, "Wake." Its late-night whistle said, "Rest." Between those signals a life was rebuilt, one careful step then another. Her daughter liked to sit on the tatami with her knees tucked beneath her, watching steam rise in the kitchen light. She asked the questions children ask when they sense a doorway they cannot yet see through. Was the war loud? Were the Americans cruel? Did the sky change color when bombs fell? The mother never told her about bodies or hunger, or the taste of fear when it climbs behind the tongue and refuses to leave. She told her instead about warmth. She told her about a hut of corrugated tin and water that arrived like summer rain inside a prison yard, and a man who stood at a threshold like a small lighthouse and refused to look inside. Some nights the mother would take a small box from a cupboard. Inside lay letters that had been opened and resealed, ration stamps that no longer bought anything, and a single paper crane folded from silver candy foil. Its wings had softened with years, yet it still held flight in a way that made the air around it feel gentle. The daughter would touch it with one finger and ask why it mattered. The mother would say that once there had been a row of them on a window ledge, breathing with the heat of showers, guarding the space where dignity had returned. The daughter tried to imagine a window that could hold hope like a row of lanterns. She could not fully. She was a child in a quiet house. She had never begged air from ice-cold water. The mother aged, but time gave her a certain lightness that youth had denied. She moved through rooms like a woman walking between familiar islands. The kettle sang, the house answered. On days when rain grayed the streets, she found herself drifting back to the rhythm of that camp. Morning roll call, work, evening steam. The old fear did not return. Something else did. The certainty that small acts can break iron. The certainty that a man with a wrench can change what a ledger believes is possible. She began to speak that truth in brief sentences to the people who could hear it. A neighbor who had lost a brother, a widow who had lost a language, a child who could not sleep when the wind lifted roof tiles. She learned that the story soothed not because it erased the war, but because it insisted that goodness is stubborn. She wrote to the women she had known when addresses were finally possible. Many letters vanished. Some returned with new names signed at the bottom. One arrived with a pressed flower taped to the corner. Another came with a sketch of a Quonset roof and a note that said only, "I still dream of the sound." She read those words aloud at the table and felt the room sway as if the sea were beneath them again. The daughter watched her, and in her watching learned that grief can be carried like a jug if the handle is strong. Years later, the daughter took her to a museum that held a display about the Pacific War. There were maps behind glass and helmets that had lost their heads and photographs of men smiling at cameras they did not know were looking back from history. In a corner stood a rusted section of pipe, labeled in a tidy script. Field plumbing, improvised, no mention of who had bent it, no mention of the humidity that blurred the edges of mercy. The mother placed her hand on the glass and closed her eyes. Behind her lids the steam rose again. She heard a voice say, "It is not much, but it is warm." She opened her eyes and whispered thank you to a name that no plaque would carry. At home the winter, her hair turned all the way silver. The daughter set a kettle on the stove and folded paper at the table. The mother watched her thumbs pinch a neat crease. "This one is for the man at the door," the daughter said. "This one is for the women who stood in the steam. This one is for the water that came hot when no one expected it." They placed the cranes in a line on the shelf where the morning light could reach them. When the sun moved, the wings threw a soft shine onto the kitchen wall. The mother sat in that shine and felt younger than her bones the day illness came. It arrived, like a visitor who refuses to sit. Breaths shortened. Steps needed a handrail. The doctor spoke in careful tones. The daughter boiled water before the words were all the way finished. She set the kettle near the bed and kept the room warm enough to make the window cloud. The mother slept and woke and slept again. She did not speak of pain. She spoke of steam. She asked for the box. The daughter brought it. The silver crane caught the light through a gap in the curtain and made a little sky on the bedsheet. The mother touched the wing and smiled, lips barely parted. Near the end, rain began to fall and did not stop for 2 days. The roof tapped a steady beat that sounded like footfalls leaving and returning. The mother asked for tea. The daughter brewed it and held the cup while steam climbed. The mother breathed it in, as if the air itself had become a memory she could swallow. She turned her head a little and said, "I was seen." It was not a confession and not a request. It was a fact. Then she slept, and when she woke, she asked her daughter to listen. Not to her voice, she said to the kettle. After the funeral, the house was busy for a while. Then the busy left, as busyness does. The daughter kept the cranes on the shelf and the box in the cupboard. She boiled water every morning because grief likes a ritual, and ritual likes heat. She stood by the window and watched the first white breath rise from the pot. The world beyond it was the same, but not the same. A neighbor waved, a bicycle bell trilled, a child laughed 2 doors down. In that ordinary sound she heard a small echo of a tin roof far away and a threshold watched by a man who understood that rules are not the only fences in a life. One spring she wrote her mother's story in a notebook that had belonged to the family for years. She began with a date, because dates hold doors open. She wrote about Guam and a truck and the first smell of bacon that did not belong to her language. She wrote about steam rising where no one expected it. She wrote about a cowboy whose name she did not know, who turned kindness into a system that hummed. She stopped several times and held the page flat with her palm, as if stories need weight to stay. When she finished, she placed the notebook beside the kettle and left it there like an invitation. Sometimes she imagines the cranes on that old sill still catching light. She imagines the hut standing, even if only in memory, shining in a brief slant of afternoon sun. She imagines a valve turned by a hand that did not need applause. These images arrive when the kettle sings, the kettle clicks, the room fills. She closes her eyes and hears the old line in her mother's voice. It is not much, it is warm. She opens the notebook, writes that sentence again, and waits for the steam to curl into the morning like a promise that has outlived everyone who first spoke it.